The afternoon sun was hanging lazily in the sky, casting long shadows on the quiet streets of the town. Two police officers sat in their patrol car, driving slowly down the road. To anyone watching, it looked like just another routine day for law enforcement. The streets were calm, children played in the yards, and neighbors chatted by their porches. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But for these officers, the silence didn't bring peace. It only made them more eager to find something suspicious. Inside the car, one officer tapped the steering wheel impatiently, while the other sipped on lukewarm coffee. They weren't really looking for criminals, though. That was what their badge and duty required. Instead, they were scanning faces, glances, and movements, not through the lens of fairness, but through the filter of their own prejudice. A man walking too slowly, a teenager with a hoodie, a stranger carrying a bag. Anyone could be a target in their eyes. They had driven this route many times before. For them, the routine patrol wasn't just about safety, it was about power. The shiny badges on their uniforms gave them the authority to stop anyone they wanted, ask questions, and control the situation. And deep down, they liked that feeling. They felt important, like the guardians of the town. But often their judgments weren't guided by evidence. Instead, they were guided by quick assumptions, many times directed at people who looked different from them. The neighborhood they were driving through was peaceful. Families were returning home from work, cars parked neatly along the sidewalks, and kids rode bicycles with wide smiles on their faces. There was no crime, no noise, no trouble. Still, the officers' eyes darted around, restless, almost hungry for confrontation. It was as if they couldn't be satisfied with calmness. They needed action to prove their authority. The officer in the passenger seat leaned back and muttered something about how quiet days are boring. The driver nodded, his eyes narrowing at anyone who came into view. They laughed lightly about how they might shake someone up just to keep the day interesting. For them, power wasn't just about protecting people. It was also about reminding others who was in charge. As they rolled past each block, they carried an invisible weight of bias. Whenever they saw someone who fit their idea of normal, they didn't bother to look twice. But the moment they spotted someone who looked different, someone whose skin color, clothing, or walk didn't match what they thought belonged in the neighborhood, their attention sharpened. That person instantly became a suspect, even if he had done nothing wrong. The sound of their radio filled the silence in the car every few minutes, reporting minor issues in other parts of the city. But their focus was elsewhere. Their eyes scanned the sidewalks, scanning every person they could see. It was a strange kind of hunting, not for justice, but for targets who could validate their prejudice. The car windows were rolled halfway down, letting in a light breeze mixed with the smell of freshly cut grass. The calmness of the environment contrasted sharply with the officers' inner restlessness. They weren't looking to keep the peace. They were looking for something to disturb it. Their minds were wired with suspicion, built over years of thinking that certain people didn't belong in certain places. As they drove further, one of them adjusted his sunglasses and spotted a man walking down the street ahead. He looked like any professional heading home after work, neatly dressed and carrying a briefcase. But to the officers, the man stood out. Not because he was doing anything wrong, but because their biased minds told them he didn't fit the scene. Their eyes narrowed as they approached him. The driver slowed the car and the passenger straightened up in his seat, suddenly alert. For them, the routine patrol had just taken a turn. The quiet afternoon no longer felt boring. It now had a potential target. Neither of them thought about whether the man had done anything wrong. Neither cared that he looked calm, polite, and completely harmless. What mattered was the story they had already told themselves in their heads, that this man didn't belong, and they had the right to question him. The irony was that, until this point, the patrol had been uneventful. Nothing dangerous, nothing alarming, nothing illegal had crossed their path. But prejudice doesn't wait for facts. It works like a shadow, creeping into thoughts, whispering false conclusions, and convincing people that suspicion equals guilt. And so, with their own minds clouded by bias, the officers prepared themselves for a confrontation that never needed to happen. The neighborhood was still filled with the laughter of children, the hum of lawnmowers, and the calm of everyday life. Yet inside that patrol car, the atmosphere had shifted. The routine had become the setup for something much bigger. The officers didn't know it yet, but the decision they were about to make would not only change the course of their day, but also shake the very foundation of their judgment. As they slowed the car, exchanging quick glances of agreement, they felt that familiar rush of power. It was the kind of thrill that came not from protecting people, but from exercising control over them. They didn't realize that this moment, the one they thought would give them control, was actually the beginning of their greatest humiliation. And so, on what should have been just another ordinary patrol, a simple drive through quiet streets, Prejudice was about to create a storm that would leave everyone talking. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, painting the neighborhood in warm orange and gold. On the sidewalk, a man walked at an easy pace, his polished shoes tapping gently against the concrete. He carried a black leather briefcase in one hand and a jacket folded neatly over his arm. His stride was calm and steady, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had nothing to hide and no reason to rush. To anyone watching with an open mind, he was simply another professional finishing his day and heading home. His name was Raymond, though most people in the town would soon know him by a different title. He had worked hard for years, building a career with discipline, intelligence, and leadership. Behind his composed expression was a man who believed in fairness and justice, not just in words but in action. But none of that mattered to strangers who judged him by appearance alone. On this day, Raymond was just another face on the street, a face that two officers in a passing patrol car decided didn't fit. As he walked, he noticed the little details that many people overlooked. The laughter of children echoing from the park, the smell of barbecue drifting from a backyard, the flutter of leaves as the evening breeze picked up. He appreciated these things not just as a man returning home, but as someone who valued community and the sense of belonging it gave. This neighborhood was part of the town he served and protected, and he took pride in that. What he didn't know was that the patrol car creeping down the road behind him was filled with restless eyes. The officers inside weren't appreciating the peace of the evening. Instead, they were scanning him, dissecting his walk, his skin, his briefcase. To them, his calm steps looked suspicious. His neat clothing looked too formal for the area, and his presence more than anything else seemed like it didn't belong. Raymond had grown used to this feeling, the heavy gaze of suspicion that followed him in certain places. Even when he wasn't in uniform, he could sense when people looked at him with doubt, as if his very existence was cause for question. He had learned to carry himself with dignity, not letting prejudice disturb his peace. But that didn't mean he was blind to it. As he adjusted his grip on the briefcase and continued walking, he felt it again, the weight of eyes watching him. He glanced briefly over his shoulder and noticed the patrol car slowing down. The officers inside were staring directly at him. A quiet sigh left his chest. He had seen this pattern before. He wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't disturbing anyone. Yet he knew what was about to happen. His calm walk home was about to be interrupted by assumptions. Still, he did not change his pace. He did not show fear or anger. He simply kept walking with the same steady rhythm. Years of experience had taught him patience. Years of leadership had given him composure. And years of dealing with prejudice had built in him a strength that could not be easily broken. The officers, however, were reading an entirely different story in their minds. They whispered to each other, their voices low but eager. To them, the man with the briefcase wasn't a neighbor, a professional, or someone heading home. To them, he was a possible suspect. They didn't know what crime he could have committed, but in their eyes, he didn't need to commit one to raise suspicion. As Raymond neared the corner of the street, he felt the patrol car edging closer. Its tires moved slowly against the pavement, the engine humming like a shadow following his steps. He knew the sound well. He had ridden in those cars many times before, but always in uniform, always with purpose. This time it was different. This time he was being watched as a target. The evening air grew heavier around him. He could hear the faint chatter of the officers inside, though he couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He already knew what was coming. And yet, despite the certainty, he kept his head high and his expression calm. If there was going to be a confrontation, he would face it with dignity. To him, walking home was supposed to be simple. To the officers, it was an excuse. And in that gap, in that difference of perception, was a truth that revealed more than either side realized. For Raymond, this walk would become a test of patience and character. For the officers, it would become a test of judgment. one that they were already failing before a single word was spoken. The silence of the street was soon broken by the sound of the patrol car pulling over, the crunch of its tires pressing against the curb. Raymond did not stop walking, not yet. He waited for the inevitable call, the inevitable order, the inevitable accusation, and when it came, he would be ready, not just as a man, but as someone who knew the power of truth. His calm steps, his quiet dignity, and his steady composure were about to collide with prejudice in the rawest form, and though he didn't yet reveal his identity, he already carried the strength of it in his heart. The walk that began as a simple journey home was no longer just that. It was becoming the beginning of a story, one that would leave two officers stunned, humiliated, and forced to face the reality of their own bias. The sound of squealing brakes broke the stillness of the evening. The patrol car rolled to a slow halt beside the sidewalk, its shadow stretching across the pavement like a dark hand reaching for the man who was just trying to walk home. The quiet rhythm of Raymond's footsteps was interrupted by the commanding slam of a car door. One officer stepped out quickly, his boots heavy against the ground, while the other remained inside, eyes narrowed, watching every movement as though preparing for a battle. "Hey, you there," the officer barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the calm air. His tone wasn't the tone of someone asking a question. It was the tone of an order, the tone of suspicion already turned into judgment. Raymond slowed his steps but did not stop immediately. He turned his head slightly, his face calm but his eyes alert. He had been through moments like this before. He could almost predict every word that was about to be spoken. The officer's hand rested near his belt, not quite on his weapon, but close enough to send a message. "I'm in control here." "You live around here?" the officer demanded, stepping closer. His partner leaned out of the car window, scanning Raymond up and down as if every detail of his appearance was evidence of something wrong. Raymond nodded politely. "Yes, officer. I'm heading home." His voice was steady, respectful, not confrontational. He believed in composure, but his calmness only seemed to annoy the officer further. "Heading home, huh? From where?" The officer's eyes narrowed, his tone carrying more doubt than curiosity. He circled slightly, as though trying to corner him with words. To them, his briefcase was suspicious. His formal clothes were suspicious. Even his confidence was suspicious. Raymond adjusted the briefcase in his hand. "From work," he replied, his tone still even. He wasn't hiding anything because there was nothing to hide, but the answer didn't satisfy them. Prejudice rarely listens to reason. "Work? What kind of work?" The officer pressed, his words sharp, almost mocking. "Why don't you show me some ID then if you've got nothing to hide?" The second officer finally stepped out of the car, stretching as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't speak yet, but the smirk on his face showed he was already convinced of his partner's suspicions. 2 against 1, their body language carried the weight of authority, as though Raymond's calm explanations were nothing compared to their assumptions. Raymond felt the eyes of neighbors from across the street. A few people had slowed down, pretending to water lawns or check their mailboxes, but their real focus was on the scene unfolding. It was a familiar image, 2 officers stopping a black man who was simply existing. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, showing his hands clearly as he pulled out his wallet. Years of training taught him the importance of careful movements in tense situations. He held the wallet open, offering it. But before he could even speak, the officer closest to him snatched it with a force that showed impatience, not professionalism. "What's the rush?" the officer muttered sarcastically, flipping through the contents. "You nervous?" "No," Raymond said calmly. "Just want to get home." The second officer laughed quietly. "Yeah, sure. People like you are always in a hurry to get out of sight." It wasn't just the words. It was the way they were spoken. Loaded with prejudice, dripping with assumptions. To them, Raymond wasn't a professional, a neighbor, or even just a man. He was a suspect, and in their minds, suspects were guilty until proven innocent. As they inspected his wallet, one officer asked questions faster than Raymond could answer. "Where do you work? Why are you dressed like that? You don't look like you belong on this street. Who do you know here?" Each question wasn't really a question, it was an accusation, framed in the disguise of inquiry. Raymond answered each one with patience. "I work here in this city. I live nearby. I'm walking home from my job." His words were simple, but the officers weren't listening for truth. They were listening for cracks, for excuses, for anything they could twist into guilt. The tension grew thicker. The second officer stepped closer, invading Raymond's space, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "What's in the case?" he asked suddenly, pointing at the briefcase. "My work files," Raymond replied. His voice was still calm, but his patience was thinning. He knew where this was headed. Prejudice wasn't satisfied with answers. It was only satisfied with control. The officer reached out, tapping the case with his finger. "Open it," he ordered, not as a request but as a command. Raymond hesitated for the first time, not out of fear but out of disappointment. He had lived his life serving justice, upholding laws, building trust in communities. Yet here he was, treated as though none of that mattered, reduced to a stereotype by two men who wore the same badge he did. The scene had become an unjust stop. A man walking home had become a suspect. A simple evening had become a stage for prejudice to display itself. And yet, through it all, Raymond stood tall, his composure unshaken. Because deep down he knew the truth would soon reveal itself. And when it did, the officer's arrogance would collapse under the weight of their mistake. But for now, the sidewalk had become a courtroom, and these two officers were playing judge, jury, and executioner. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. The air around the sidewalk grew heavier, almost as if the neighborhood itself could sense what was happening. A walk that should have been ordinary was now turning into a performance of power and prejudice. The two officers stood over Raymond, their posture rigid, their eyes sharp, their voices dripping with suspicion. It was no longer just a stop, it was becoming a confrontation. One built on nothing more than assumptions. Raymond stood still, his briefcase still in his hand, his wallet taken from him, and the officers circling like vultures who had found prey. He knew the pattern. He had seen it before, on the streets, in the news, in countless stories where people who looked like him were stopped, questioned, and humiliated for no reason other than bias. But he also knew something the officers did not. Patience and truth were his strongest weapons. The taller officer took a step closer, his voice louder now, as though volume could make suspicion sound like fact. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" He sneered. "People like you don't usually carry briefcases unless they're hiding something." His partner chuckled, the sound cold and mocking, as if the situation was entertainment rather than duty. Neighbors had begun to notice more openly now. Curtains shifted in windows. A man watering his plants froze, pretending to adjust the hose just to keep watching. Two kids on bicycles stopped at the corner, whispering to each other about what was going on. The street, usually alive with evening calm, now pulsed with unease. Raymond remained calm, though inside a quiet storm brewed. He had spent years teaching younger officers about integrity, about respecting the community, about what it truly meant to serve. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal by men who should have been his brothers in service. He kept his tone even. "Officers, I assure you I am not a threat. I'm simply walking home." But prejudice is rarely softened by politeness. The shorter officer stepped closer, his hand brushing the holster at his side, a silent warning. "Funny," he said with a smirk. "Because I think you're hiding something. Why so calm if you've got nothing to hide? Most guilty people try to act calm." It's suspicious, the irony was heavy. Calmness was suspicious. Nervousness would have been suspicious. Silence would have been suspicious. To them, every possible reaction was guilt. That was the trap of bias. It twisted reality until nothing could prove innocence. "Open the case," the taller officer barked again, his patience thinning. "Now." Raymond slowly placed the briefcase on the hood of the patrol car. His movements were deliberate, careful, so there would be no excuse for threatening behavior. He clicked open the latches and revealed neat stacks of documents, official papers, and a laptop. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just the belongings of a working man heading home. But the officers weren't satisfied. They flipped through the papers roughly, scattering them across the hood as though looking for invisible evidence. "Could be fake," one muttered. "Doesn't mean anything." The tension wasn't just in their words anymore, it was in the way they loomed over him, in the way their voices rose with every sentence, in the way their presence turned a calm street into a stage for intimidation. The children on their bikes pedaled away quickly, whispering about what they had just seen. The man with the hose shut off the water and stepped inside, shaking his head. Everyone watching could see the imbalance, the unfairness of it all. Raymond breathed deeply, holding his composure. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this. Armed standoffs, heated protests, life-or-death calls. But somehow this moment stung more. Not because of fear, but because of disappointment. These men wore the same badge he did. Yet instead of protecting, they were profiling. Instead of serving, they were harassing. The taller officer shoved a paper back into the briefcase and slammed it shut. "Doesn't add up," he muttered. "You're not telling us the whole story." His voice was sharp, his tone final, as though his assumption carried the weight of law. Raymond finally met his eyes, steady and firm. "With all due respect, officer, I've told you the truth. If you can't see it, that's not my fault." His words were calm, but they carried a quiet strength, one that unsettled the officers. The partner laughed again, but this time it sounded forced, almost nervous. He wasn't used to suspects speaking with such composure. Usually fear gave them control. But here was a man who didn't flinch, didn't stammer, didn't lower his gaze. His confidence created a tension the officers hadn't expected. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the faint rustle of leaves. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had power in their hands, authority, weapons, the law on their side. Yet something about this man made them uneasy. They didn't know why, but deep down they could feel it. He wasn't like the others. They stopped. Still, they pushed forward. Prejudice doesn't retreat easily. The taller officer gestured toward the car. "We'll sort this out downtown. Put your hands behind your back." And with those words, the tension snapped into action. The unjust stop was escalating into an arrest. The very thing Raymond had predicted was happening. But what the officers didn't know was that with every step they took, they were marching toward their own humiliation. The truth was close, closer than they realized, and when it came out, the weight of their mistake would crush the arrogance they carried so proudly. For now, though, the tension was at its peak. The calm street was no longer calm. The walk home was no longer simple. And the man they thought was powerless was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The command hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "Put your hands behind your back." It was the phrase Raymond had been expecting, though he had hoped the officers would think twice before crossing that line. The street, so calm only minutes earlier, now felt like a stage for injustice. The neighbors peeking through their windows held their breath. Everyone could sense that this moment was no longer just about suspicion. It was about to become humiliation. Raymond did not argue. He did not raise his voice or resist. Instead, he slowly placed his briefcase back on the hood of the patrol car and lifted his hands where they could see them. His movements were measured, cautious, not because he was guilty, but because he knew how quickly situations like this could turn dangerous. Years of experience had taught him that silence and calmness could sometimes save lives. The taller officer stepped forward with handcuffs glinting in the fading sunlight. His face carried a look of pride, as if this arrest was proof of his instincts, proof of his authority. The second officer watched with a smirk, arms folded, already convinced that they had caught someone. To them, this was victory. To Raymond, it was disappointment. The cold steel of the cuffs closed tightly around his wrists with a loud click. The sound echoed louder than it should have, slicing through the quiet evening air. It wasn't just the sound of cuffs locking. It was the sound of dignity being stripped away, of authority being abused, of prejudice being disguised as procedure. Raymond felt the sting, not of the metal but of the injustice. A woman across the street gasped softly. She had been watching from her porch, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He didn't do anything," she whispered to herself, though no one could hear. She wanted to shout, to step forward, to stop what was happening, but fear held her back. Fear of the same badge that was now being misused in front of her. The officers began to pat him down roughly, their hands searching his pockets, his jacket, even his shoes, as if desperate to find something, anything that could justify what they were doing. But there was nothing. Just a man heading home, carrying nothing more than work papers, a wallet, and the weight of prejudice on his shoulders. "You think you're clever, don't you?" The shorter officer sneered, shoving the empty briefcase shut. "Walking around like you own the place. Bet you didn't expect to get caught." "Caught?" The word rang in Raymond's mind like an insult. Caught was for criminals. Caught was for the guilty. He was neither. But he didn't let the anger show. Instead, he stood tall, his wrists bound, his eyes calm. He knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. As they pushed him toward the patrol car, the taller officer grinned, glancing at the neighbors watching from behind their curtains. It was a show of power, a message. This is what happens when we're in charge. They opened the back door of the car and shoved Raymond inside, the cuffs digging deeper into his skin as he shifted into the narrow seat. The slam of the door behind him was final, like the closing of a cage. Inside the car, the smell of worn leather and dust filled his nose. The metal barrier between the front and back seats stood as a reminder of the line they had drawn between officers and suspects. Raymond sat still, staring out of the window. His reflection in the glass showed not a criminal, but a man whose patience was about to teach a lesson far greater than any lecture. Outside, whispers began to spread among the neighbors. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered quietly about how unfair it was. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene from a distance. They didn't know who he really was, but they knew what they were seeing was wrong. The taller officer climbed into the driver's seat, still wearing that smug smile. "Another one off the street," he muttered proudly, starting the engine. His partner chuckled, replying, "Yeah, didn't even put up a fight. Too easy." They thought they had won. They thought their prejudice had been proven right. But they didn't know the truth yet. They didn't know the man in their back seat had more authority than both of them combined. They didn't know the man they had just cuffed was not only innocent but their superior. Raymond sat silently, his hands cuffed, his briefcase left behind on the hood of the car. He could have spoken then. He could have revealed who he was. But he didn't, not yet, because sometimes the greatest lesson comes when the arrogant are allowed to dig their own hole. And these two officers were digging fast. The car began to roll forward, its tires crunching against the pavement. The neighborhood slowly disappeared behind them, but the memory of what had just happened would linger in every window, every porch, every whispered conversation later that night. People had witnessed not an arrest, but an injustice, and as the engine hummed and the cuffs pressed into his wrists, Raymond sat quietly, his mind steady. He wasn't worried about his freedom. He wasn't worried about proving his innocence. He was only waiting for the right moment, the moment when the truth would shatter their arrogance, when their faces would fall, when they would realize just how badly they had misjudged the man they thought was powerless. For now, though, he let them enjoy their illusion of power, because soon the humiliation would belong to them. The patrol car rumbled down the street, its engine humming, the world outside slipping past in a blur. Inside, the air was tense, thick with arrogance on one side and quiet strength on the other. The two officers in the front chuckled from time to time, whispering comments to each other, their voices laced with pride. In their minds, they had just scored another win, another suspicious man caught before he could cause trouble. But in the back seat, Raymond sat with his hands cuffed, shoulders steady, his gaze calm. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even angry, not on the surface. He simply looked out the window, watching the town he served roll by. Every street, every building, every corner was familiar to him, because it was his responsibility to know them. This wasn't just a city where he lived. It was the city he was sworn to protect. The taller officer glanced back through the mirror, his smirk widening when he saw Raymond's composed face. "Look at him," he muttered, "acting all calm like he's better than us." His partner laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, let's see how calm he is when we book him. Won't be so tough then." Raymond listened quietly. He could have spoken then. He could have ended their mockery with a single sentence, a simple reveal. But he didn't, not yet. Instead, he let them carry on, let their arrogance grow heavier, because he knew the fall would be harder when the truth finally came crashing down. Minutes later, the car stopped in front of the station. The building stood tall, its glass doors reflecting the fading sun. To the officers, it was just another drop-off, another suspect to process. To Raymond, it was more than familiar. He had walked through those doors countless times, not in cuffs, but in uniform, with authority, with respect. And soon, the roles would reverse in a way they couldn't yet imagine. The officers dragged him out roughly, guiding him toward the entrance. People passing by glanced curiously, some slowing their steps to watch. From the outside, it looked like a routine arrest. No one knew the irony of what was unfolding. As they pushed him into the building, the receptionist behind the desk looked up. Her eyes widened, her mouth slightly open in shock. She recognized him instantly. She knew exactly who he was. But before she could speak, Raymond gave her a calm, steady look, a silent message to wait to let the scene play out. She swallowed her words, watching as the officers marched him past her, completely unaware of the storm they were walking into. The taller officer slapped some papers down on the counter, speaking with exaggerated confidence. "Got ourselves a suspicious guy. Might be hiding something. We'll book him and see what shakes out." His partner grinned, nodding as if they had just done something heroic. Raymond stood silently between them, his posture straight despite the cuffs. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight. He simply waited, letting their words echo through the room, letting their ignorance hang in the air for everyone present to witness. Finally, the moment arrived. A senior officer stepped out of an office nearby, his face familiar and respectful. He froze mid-step when he saw who was standing there in cuffs. His eyes darted from Raymond to the arresting officers, confusion flashing across his face. Then slowly his expression hardened, disbelief turning to anger. "Do you know who this is?" the senior officer asked, his voice low but sharp like a blade slicing through the arrogance in the room. The two officers looked at each other, puzzled, their smirks fading. Just some guy walking around suspiciously," the taller one replied. The senior officer shook his head in disbelief. His eyes turned to Raymond, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Raymond spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet authority. "Perhaps you should tell them," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of truth. The senior officer straightened, his jaw tight. "You just arrested the chief of police." The words dropped like a bomb. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. The receptionist gasped softly. A few officers nearby froze, their eyes wide with shock. And the two arresting officers? Their faces went pale, their smug expressions collapsing into horror. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. The man they had mocked, cuffed, and humiliated wasn't just innocent. He was their superior. Raymond held their gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply let the truth hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was power. And in that moment, the officers understood just how badly they had failed. The taller officer stammered, his words breaking. We didn't know." But his voice trailed off, drowned by the weight of their mistake. Raymond didn't respond right away. He let their shame settle in, let the silence speak louder than anything he could have said. Then, with quiet authority, he asked for the cuffs to be removed. The senior officer stepped forward immediately, unlocking them with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear of Raymond, but from anger at the injustice his colleagues had committed. As the steel clicked open and fell away, Raymond rubbed his wrists lightly, then straightened his suit. His composure never wavered. He didn't need to shout or punish. His very presence was enough to strip the arrogance from the two officers who now stood frozen, their heads lowered, their pride shattered. The calm revelation was complete. The man they thought was powerless had revealed himself to be the most powerful figure in the room, and the lesson was only beginning. The words hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. "You just arrested the chief of police." For a moment, the station was frozen. Time seemed to stop. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of papers on the desk. The arresting officers stood stiff, their mouths half open, their arrogance draining from their faces. It was as if someone had pulled the ground from under them, leaving nothing but the weight of their mistake. Raymond, still calm, still steady, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve where the metal had pressed too tightly against his skin. He didn't look angry. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood with a quiet authority that spoke louder than shouting ever could. His presence filled the room now, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as the man who led the entire department. The taller officer stammered first, his voice shaking. "Chief, this has to be a mistake. We didn't know." His words cracked as his partner looked around desperately, searching for an escape from the humiliation pressing down on them. The receptionist covered her mouth, her eyes wide as she whispered to a colleague. "They cuffed the chief. Can you believe it?" In seconds, the news began to ripple through the station. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and officers gathered quietly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as they realized what had happened. The senior officer who had revealed the truth stepped closer, his face flushed with controlled anger. "Did you two even bother to check before treating him like a criminal?" His voice was sharp, his disappointment heavy. "You dragged in the man who leads this department, the man you're supposed to follow with cuffs on his wrists like he was trash on the street." The two officers' bravado collapsed completely. Their backs hunched, their eyes darted everywhere except toward Raymond. The smirks they had worn so proudly earlier were gone, replaced by trembling lips and pale faces. Raymond finally broke his silence. His voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of command. "You judged me not by my actions but by your assumptions. You saw my skin before you saw me. You saw suspicion where there was none. And now you see the truth." The words cut deeper than any punishment. They were not shouted. They didn't need to be. The calmness made them sharper, the truth undeniable. The room was silent again, every officer listening, every word sinking in like stone. The taller officer swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he tried to defend himself. We thought you were suspicious. You were walking in a neighborhood that didn't..." But he stopped, realizing too late what he had admitted. He had said it out loud, the very prejudice that guided his actions. Raymond tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't belong?" he repeated softly. The officer's silence was the answer. The shame was heavy and there was no excuse strong enough to lift it. Around them whispers grew. Officers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring at the two who had brought this humiliation on the department. The truth was no longer confined to the small group. It was spreading through every corner of the building. The stunning truth wasn't just about who Raymond was. It was about the ugliness the officers had exposed within themselves. The shorter officer finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Chief, we're sorry. We didn't mean..." Raymond raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't apologize to me," he said calmly. "Apologize to the badge you wear. Apologize to the oath you broke when you let prejudice guide your duty." The words hit harder than any punishment could. The two officers lowered their heads, their shame burning hotter with every second. They wanted to disappear, to rewind time, to undo the arrogance that had led them here. But there was no undoing. The truth was out and it was stunning, humiliating, final. Other officers in the room straightened their backs, some nodding slightly in respect toward Raymond. The way he handled the moment, with patience, with calm authority, reminded them why he was chief. He didn't need anger to command the room. His dignity alone was enough to put the guilty to shame. Raymond took a step closer to the two officers, his eyes firm but not cruel. "This is not about me," he said softly, yet every word carried weight. "This is about what happens when judgment replaces justice. If you can treat your chief this way, imagine how you treat those without a voice, those without power. That is the true disgrace here." The silence after his words was crushing. The truth had landed and it left no room for denial. One by one, the watching officers looked away from the guilty pair, their respect for Raymond shining more clearly now. The two arresting officers, meanwhile, stood in the wreckage of their own arrogance, their authority crumbling like sand slipping through fingers. The stunning truth was complete. The man they had mocked, the man they had doubted, the man they had cuffed and dragged was not only innocent, he was their leader. And now their humiliation was a lesson not just for them but for everyone who had witnessed the scene. Raymond turned away, his composure intact, his step steady. He didn't need to punish them further. The truth itself had already done the work, and it would follow them like a shadow, long after the cuffs had been removed, long after the whispers had faded. The station was still buzzing with whispers long after the cuffs had been removed. The shocking truth, that the man dragged in like a suspect was actually their chief, had spread through every corner of the building. Officers who hadn't even been present at the arrest had already heard the story. Some shook their heads in disbelief, some felt shame, and others felt anger that two of their own could act with such arrogance. But Raymond, calm as ever, stood tall in the center of it all. His wrists bore faint red marks from the handcuffs, but his dignity was untouched. He didn't need to shout or demand punishment. The silence around him, the faces of those watching, and the broken pride of the two officers were enough proof that a lesson was already sinking in. The arresting officers stood pale and stiff, their eyes glued to the floor. The weight of humiliation pressed down on them like a heavy chain. Hours earlier, they had laughed in pride, certain they were in control. Now, they felt powerless, their authority stripped away not by force but by the truth they had ignored. Raymond took a slow breath before he spoke. His voice was steady, each word deliberate as if carved into stone. "This," he said softly, "is what happens when prejudice takes the place of duty." Every officer in the room straightened slightly, listening intently. The chief wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His calmness was sharper than any anger could ever be. "You looked at me," he continued, his eyes shifting between the two men, "and you didn't see a citizen. You didn't see a man heading home from work. You didn't see someone you swore to protect. You saw a suspect. You saw guilt where there was none. And why? Because of the color of my skin? Because I didn't fit the picture in your head of who belongs." The words echoed through the room. The guilty officers flinched, their shame deepening with every syllable. But Raymond didn't stop. His message wasn't just for them. It was for everyone present, for everyone who wore the same badge. "The badge you wear," he said firmly, "is not a license to judge. It is not a weapon for arrogance. It is a promise. A promise to serve with fairness, to protect without bias, to uphold the law with integrity. When you break that promise, you do more than humiliate yourselves. You dishonor the badge and you destroy the trust of the people we swore to protect." The silence that followed was heavy. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their heads, all of them reflecting on his words. The truth was sharp, undeniable, unforgettable. Raymond then softened his tone, though his strength never wavered. "What happened today should never happen. Not to me, not to anyone. If you let your prejudice blind you, you don't just fail as officers, you fail as human beings." The taller officer finally whispered, his voice trembling. "Chief, we're sorry." But Raymond shook his head slowly. "Sorry is not enough. Change is what matters. Learn from this. Remember this moment. Let it remind you every single time you put on that uniform that your duty is to protect, not to profile. To serve, not to shame." The words struck deep. For the two officers, the lesson was personal. A scar they would carry for the rest of their careers. For the rest of the station, it was a reminder, a warning, a call to be better. Raymond adjusted his jacket, lifted his briefcase from the desk, and turned toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The lesson was carved into the silence he left behind. As he stepped outside, the evening air greeted him again. The neighborhood he had walked through earlier was still calm, still filled with the laughter of children, the smell of dinners being prepared, the quiet rhythm of daily life. The same neighborhood that had witnessed prejudice was now also part of a story of truth and dignity. People who had seen him taken away in cuffs would soon hear the full story. They would learn that the man humiliated in front of them was not only innocent but their chief. And that truth would spread further than the shame. It would spark conversations, reflections, and hopefully change. Raymond walked on, his step steady, his shoulders straight. The marks on his wrists would fade, but the memory of this day would not. It would live on, not as a story of his humiliation, but as a reminder of why he wore the badge in the first place. The lesson was clear, and it was unforgettable. Prejudice has no place in justice. Authority without fairness is nothing but abuse, and true strength is not in the power to control, but in the dignity to lead, even in the face of injustice. The officers who cuffed him would never forget the sight of his calm face as the truth was revealed. Their arrogance had crumbled, their pride shattered, and for the rest of their careers, every time they reached for their badge, they would remember the day they tried to bring down a man who was not only innocent, but the chief of police himself. The story ended not with rage but with revelation, and in that revelation was a lesson that no one present would ever forget.